Hi everybody, welcome back. We're now in topic 6 of Unit 2. We're almost halfway through the class. Once we get to the midpoint, the sort of balance of how things get taught shifts, and there's a lot more individualized instruction. In the next unit, there'll be only 3 or 4, perhaps 5 of these topical conversations as opposed to 7, and in Unit 4, there's only 1. So it really becomes more individualized in pursuing things that you're interested in specifically. One thing that a lot of people are interested in is NGOs and non-governmental organizations, entities that are not formally affiliated with governments. And there are things that perhaps should have been introduced in this class on day 1, but you have to get to a point where you understand what the states are doing and what the IGOs are up to and how that all fits together before you bring NGOs into the conversation. Countries have a hard time giving up sovereignty to each other or to IGOs, to the intergovernmental organizations. So you can imagine that they might have lots of trouble giving up sovereignty to organizations that are not states. That's one thing to recognize peers, and it's another thing to recognize some other entity altogether. So that's sort of the point of what we're going to look at today, what the role is of NGOs formally at the UN, the structural role, and the pros and cons of what that means in the modern era. So let's take a look at these starting here. And I put revisiting NGOs because I've mentioned them several times throughout the class, even if we haven't formally looked at their role. So if the I in IGO stands for intergovernmental organization, IGO, then the N stands for non-governmental organization. So an NGO is officially that, an organization that is not formally part of any government. And in the modern era, it's a little bit trickier because there are several governments, particularly those that are more repressive in nature or have less of an open society, that start off organizations that they intend to act in the role of civil society or of private organizations, even though they've actually started with a government. So sometimes they're these weird things called government organized NGOs or GONGOs. You don't have to remember that. Just keep in mind that officially these have no formal relationship with states, that they may partner on projects but they're not involved. That doesn't mean they won't necessarily take funds from a government if the funds have fewer strings attached or are lined up with what the NGO is looking for. For example, in the United States, in the George Bush era, there were several programs started where the idea was to take money that the government might have spent on social services, turn them over to local nonprofits, to local agencies, church groups, homeless shelters and the like, and have them partner with the government that way. And so that didn't stop those entities from being private entities, even though they were taking government money. That's not the same thing as a GONGO, a government organized NGO that is actually acting on behalf of the government's interest. And what you find sometimes in these repressive states is an NGO that's purported job is to watchdog against government corruption or abuse of power and the like, and instead is there to sort of gloss over what the government's doing wrong. So that is a difference. NGO defined, I'm going to let you read this yourself. I want to add some stuff to this. So an NGO is formal. It's institutionalized, right? They have a structure, a governing structure. They have to meet certain criteria, particularly in the United States, so that they can meet the nonprofit definition and register as a tax-free entity with the U.S. government. So you can't just be sort of a group of friends. I guess officially you and your friends who sort of maybe get together and go mow some people's lawns. You could maybe look at that as being NGO because you're not part of an organization of the government, but you're also not formalized. You're not institutionalized in that respect. So it is an organization. They're self-governing. And they're nonprofit, and the nonprofit one can confuse people because a nonprofit could have reserves. For example, FIFA is an NGO. It's the Federation Internationale of Football Associations, or the governing body of soccer, and it sort of famously has $1 billion in reserve, which they're holding in case, well, there's a lot of reasons they're holding it, but one of the reasons they're holding it is in case something goes drastically wrong with a tournament. They can spend the money on other things, or if you lose suddenly the TV contract or something, they have money in reserve. It also doesn't stop people from making a great deal of money working for them. It's a sort of a misapplication of the idea that you're altruistic, that you're private, that you're nonprofit, that you wouldn't also pay your people living good salaries. And the amount of money that somebody working for an NGO makes does not, again, relate to whether they're a nonprofit or not, though the amount of money they spend on administrative costs and salaries versus how much they spend in the field can be an indication of an NGO with problems. But if you look at what the structures are, what you're expected to do as president of an NGO or vice president or whatever, that you may be managing, depending on the scope and scale of the NGO, thousands of employees with dozens of locations, with a broad mandate to work both with donors, with governments, with local people, locals with needs, and you have the very specialized skill sets. And so hiring those folks is part of a competitive global marketplace with all kinds of sectors, and you're essentially asking someone to run the equivalent of, say, Ford Motor Company. If it's the American Red Cross, it's just with a different mandate. So you have to pay on that scope and scale. It's one of the reasons why sometimes people look and say, why is that university president making so much money? And the reason is that particularly at a big place, say like Washington State University or University of Idaho, who have branch campuses, who have extension offices all around their states. You're talking about somebody managing a gigantic corporation with offices all over the place. They need to have the skill set. So it doesn't mean you're working for peanuts. It means you're working in a marketplace. You're just nonprofit. That means you're not going to pay dividends to shareholders or take money out of it for other than reasonable and rational overhead expenses. A scope and scale is an issue. So here's one we want to talk about, which could be the difference between a national-based NGO. Some people differentiate between this as an NGO would be an individual nation, an NGO, whereas an international organization, one that spans countries, could be an INGO. And the bigger those, then somebody might call them bingos, a big international NGO. Here's the difference between in this approach. An NGO would be the American Red Cross, which is the U.S.-based branch of the International Committee of the Red Cross. So there's a Canadian Red Cross, a Mexican Red Cross, a Brazilian Red Cross. They're all members of the International Committee on the Red Cross. Actually, the ICRC, interestingly enough, is formally named the ICRC-RC. It's the International Committee of the Red Cross / Red Crescent, because in states which don't recognize Christianity or have a different state religion, for example, in Muslim states, they use the Red Crescent, which is a common symbol in Muslim states, so as to be able to get in and do their work. But that's the difference between an NGO and an INGO, and you could look all the way down to local levels. So the Red Cross does have, like Whitman County and Latah County here locally on the Palouse, have Red Cross chapters, and they are local NGOs that belong to the national NGO, which belongs to the international NGO. And you could look at something like the Rotary clubs. So there's a Rotary club in Moscow, there's a Rotary club in Pullman. There are regional Rotary clubs where they report. There's a U.S. Rotary club, and then there's an international Rotary club. And the Rotary club does very interesting work. They were one of the most important UN partners in the eradication of polio. And they've worked for decades to try and eradicate polio. So they partner with the UN, particularly they partner with the World Health Organization, and they do really good work. And it starts locally, goes nationally, goes internationally. So officially from the charter, the role that these countries, these NGOs take is listed in Chapter 10, Article 71. This says that the Economic and Social Council may make arrangements for consultation with these folks. And consultation is an interesting process, which I'll get into in a minute. There were 41 of these groups in 1946, more than 700, around 700 in 1992, and there's more than 3,000 today. There's a lot more. Thousands more NGOs that are out there that are not affiliated with the charter. So I don't mean to imply, as I go through the rest of this lecture, that all NGOs are part of this formal UN structure. Some are not part of it because they're so localized in nature they won't partner. Some are not affiliated because they want to pursue neutrality and don't want to be seen as part of any government or intergovernmental organization, and others have whatever rationale they want. Some are prevented from doing so through the application process. So the structural stuff of this, the structural stuff of this goes through a process where you get vetted through the Secretariat, and then you apply through the UN or ECOSOC's Committee on NGOs. And the Committee on NGOs hears the appeal to see whether someone wants to become what's called an NGO with consultative status. So I don't want you to so much remember this three things here, general, special, and roster, but do remember consultative status. So that's what's laid out here, right? In the charter, it says that you can make arrangements for consultation with NGOs that are concerned with matters within the competence of the Economic and Social Council. So someone who then gets consultative status, that's the important part. They're formally affiliated with the ECOSOC Commission or one of its sub-agencies in some way. Then you can get a general roster status, a special status, or rosters, general, special, roster. So this again is scope and scale, and it gives you different access to different meetings. Roster, for example, a roster NGO would not typically have an office in New York or someone who spends a lot of time there going to UN meetings, but they can make occasional specific contribution based on their competency and based on what the ECOSOC or its sub-agency is talking about at the time. So the general are the largest of these. They have the most in common with the most things that ECOSOC does, and they also tend to have a global scope and scale. So if you have a specific region you're interested in, you wouldn't go to a general meeting about that topic, but you would go to it if it was about the specific region you were working in, for example. So general sounds like they have less in common because it's sort of a general thing, but it means they're generally affiliated with any of the topics or any of the regions that ECOSOC is talking about. So there's certainly far more roster than special than general NGOs. So the good news with this is that as the UN becomes more focused on human security, as they start to look at this people-centered thing, individuals, families, communities, states, that the very important actors become NGOs, because when you have to do the work on the ground, just like it's easier for a state to affiliate with an IGO, so that the IGO, for example, through the Secretariat, can do more work in the field than the individual state can abroad in other states. So too is it easier for the UN and the ECOSOC in particular to broaden its reach by partnering with NGOs who can be all over the world doing all kinds of work. So the NGOs, it's a really good thing when you're trying to work on human security. And this is also good when you're trying to do specific topics and projects. For example, we looked at the SDGs recently. One of the SDGs is to attain clean water and sanitation. So a good NGO to partner with is the World Toilet Organization, which is a very interesting NGO that does interesting work. They have a slogan that is they want to encourage people to give a shit about sanitation, and so they're trying to promote that part of SDG 6, but they have nothing to do with most of the other SDGs. So the caveat is that they care about what's in their competence. And the good news with that is you have allies and aides working on that topic. But if you want to also work on another topic, then you need a different NGO. Because unlike states who have interest in most all topics, because that's their job, your NGO cares about something. So if a state has to care about everything, an NGO cares about something, which gives them an advantage in some ways and a disadvantage in others. Going back to the Red Cross, sometimes people get frustrated with them because they'll give them a lot of money, and then a couple of years later, or even a year later, the Red Cross is no longer present, and other NGOs need money to continue reconstruction. It's because the Red Cross's main job is disaster relief, and once you get past disaster relief, it's someone else's job to do rebuilding, because the scope of their competence and what they're looking for is that specific, peculiar thing, right? So they care about something, not about everything. Even within the field of disaster relief and recovery, they have a narrower focus than some others, or some others have a different narrow focus, and you have to partner with all of them. So good news, bad news there when it comes to working with NGOs. So let's wrap up. NGOs are really important global actors. They do a lot of good work. They're on the ground, and sometimes people get a little biased in favor of NGOs because they'll say they have boots on the ground, which is different than a lot of states who are setting policies. But a lot of this stuff has to fit together. For example, the commissions I mentioned, we're looking at the scope of the UN. Their job is to do research so that when other bodies are trying to make decisions, they have a good informed research base on which to make the decision. So you can't criticize the agency for only doing research because we needed them to have that job. We need to make good sound policy based on good sound research. Once the research leads to the policy and you go to the implementation, there's the Secretariat and governments working in conjunction with NGOs. And so that's really good, and it's very important that we have that partnership, particularly in the ongoing focus on human security that we have in the